Welcome back to another SCP Those Twisted Pines reading, dear researcher. Today we'll be reading On the Radar by Dark Stuff. We'll only be reading part of it though, because it's over an hour long and I have school to get to. So, without further ado, let's begin. On the Radar. A Twisted Pines and Wilson Wildlife Tale. An informal summary of Foundation Nexus policy. Nexuses. You probably know of them. Nexuses are population centers that also seem to attract anomalous amounts of anomalous activity, if that repetition makes sense. There are some general rules. Nexuses rarely have a population of over 30,000 people. The people themselves regard the strange happenings as normal, and the anomalies seem to follow a general theme. So, when you have a population center that basically generates anomalies, how do you interact with it? Well, most often, the Foundation has taken a fairly strange tactic due to the number of nexuses and the tendency of their residents to regard their surroundings as normal. The definition of normalcy has been molded a bit. The natures of the nexuses are, of course, to be kept from the general public, but the not general public of the nexus is to be treated as if their situation is normal. As long as their Twitter feeds don't mention that hip new mimetic drug going through town, or their Instagram doesn't show a selfie with a giant gemstone in the sky, it's all good. The Foundation only wishes to stay in close contact with the government of said nexuses, and to monitor their activity, as well as the traffic of the general public in and out. So, you can imagine that when a little mom and pop organization shows up in the middle of the Nexus to deal with the Nexus's specific problems, it doesn't so much concern the Foundation, now does it? They're not part of the general public. They aren't going to venture far out of their town. And what's a safety measure in an anomalous town but a boon to the Foundation? A little chip off their shoulder. Not much, it turns out. It's not much more than a boon. And in most cases, they stay that way. No one bats an eye at redacted Black Boxia's Vampire Hunting Society, except to check in on their progress once in a while. No one minds Expungerville's super essential oil market as long as it doesn't leave town. And no one, especially no one, takes notice of a humble little animal shelter in a sleepy town, aptly, or maybe not so aptly, named Boring, Oregon. Of course not. Why would they? 2. NX-17, Boring, Oregon. Nexus number, NX-17. Civilian designation, Boring, Oregon. Population 7,000, area class Briar. Nexus interaction protocol. NX-17 requires little cover-up. Social media or online keywords correlated to NX-17 are Boring, Oregon, town of Boring, weird animal, weird hike, and variations thereof, synonyms. Web crawlers are to tag articles, posts, and pages that contain one or more of said keywords. Anything tagged will then get reviewed by NX-17 related Site-64 personnel, and will be removed and civilians approached if found to be infringing on the maintenance of the Veil. The Foundation is to maintain a close eye on Boring elections. The mayor and town council are to know of and interact with the Foundation, under the pseudonym The Supervisors. Local elections are to be manipulated so that only Foundation-approved civilians enter office, under the criteria that they will be cooperating with the Foundation and consequently be willing to maintain the Veil. Containment Facility Site-64. Description: NX-17 is a small farming town roughly 30 kilometers southwest of Portland, Oregon. NX-17 generates, or contains, roughly 350% the average number of anomalous fauna per square kilometer as compared to the rest of the world, excluding clear outliers such as NX-18 Sloth Pit, Wisconsin, and the anti-anomalous NX-42 Dull, Scotland. Said anomalous fauna generally does not present clear and imminent danger, except in rare cases. Unlike other nexuses, anomalies from NX-17 are able to exist outside of NX-17 but rarely leave. Addendum. As of 1/20/1997, an organization dedicated to the rehabilitation of mundane and anomalous wildlife in Clackamas County has been founded. The organization is run by a civilian named Tim Wilson, born in San Diego and thus not a native to NX-17. This development has yet to incite direct Foundation actions, though some have been proposed. 3. A formal discussion of Site-64, Tim Wilson policy. Across Site Director Edgar Holman's desk slid a file of collected information on the new Boring Oregon organization. Holman pulled it towards him and opened it up. He was greeted by big block letters printing Wilson's Wildlife Shelter, headed by a Tim Wilson, roughly 10 employees and a couple volunteers. Nonprofit, small. All right, and why has this been brought to my attention? Shouldn't this just be filed? A pause between the four men in the room.
Well,
One started.
we could just file it, but we're afraid of a couple of implications.
Seeing the raised eyebrows from Holman,
Probably nothing, just something we wanted to go over with you.
the site director sat back in his chair and sighed. He had better things to do. He was in the middle of reading and signing several papers, advocating for the upgrade of unregistered anomalies, or URAs, to Special Containment Procedure Required Objects, or SCPs. When 3 Nexus 17 researchers had wanted to discuss this new development, Holman nodded and motioned for them to get it over with. The green-eyed one, boring archivist, Sanan McDowell, started first.
Okay, let's go over the basics. This organization was founded by an outsider, so we can assume that he will not treat the abnormal wildlife here as normal and may opt to draw attention to it. He's a very vocal, very politically active member of the community, and he's been known to regularly travel outside of Nexus 17.
A brown-eyed, dark-skinned, boring historian, Josh Higginbottom, chimed in. He's directly involved with the anomalous wildlife. Does think it's all magic and fantasy, highly active, travels, and very vocal. He's a prime vector for knowledge of the Nexus to leak out to the rest of the world. Edgar blew wind from his nose. All right. However, Wilson's Wildlife Shelter, is it doing its job? Josh.
I'm sorry, sir?
Edgar. Is it rehabilitating wildlife, giving animals a home, etc.? Sanan.
Yes, it's doing it. It's doing surprisingly well given the Nexus.
Edgar stirred the air. How many anomalies have they found before us?
Sanan
looked around.
You have the file in front of you right now. Take a look yourself. Page 34.
Edgar sat upright and began to flip through, scanning for page 34. Once found, the site director pressed his finger down the page until it met with notable anomaly interactions. His eyebrows slowly rose as the list just went. That's an impressive number. And all of these, they found them before we did?
Josh. We're quite literally holding a meeting tonight on whether or not to upgrade Boring to asphodel status from Briar. And that's all Tim Wilson's doing. We had no idea there were this many anomalies in Boring.
Edgar. I imagine we've been cataloging all of these somewhere, their own designations.
McDowell shook his head. We've been backlogged. We don't even have enough personnel to hunt down each of these things.
Edgar. But somehow they do, with 10 employees.
Sanan. And a growing volunteer base? Needless to say, the organization is growing fast, and the larger it gets, the more visibility it gets. We're already afraid they might make a website. We're getting off track, though.
Oh, I don't think that at all, the site director smiled. This feels, to me, like a Site 64 gold mine. Tim Wilson may be a slight danger to the Vale, but the last thing we want to do is dispel this lovely little anomaly documenting machine here. Now, he put his elbows on his desk. What we have to do is figure out how to keep it running while keeping its visibility low. Not such a hard task, I can imagine, for people who have been keeping Nexus 17 locked up tight for, 14 years? One of the three researchers gulped nervously. What I'm saying is, Tim Wilson stays. Closely monitored, but he stays. And I'll leave the issue of covering his tracks up to you. Has he been an issue yet?
Josh breathed through his teeth, paused a second, and then hung and shook his head.
Good. We can hope that he'll never actually become one. That's all. Submit it as an issue for a board of directors meeting if you're unsatisfied with my answer. Now, I have other business to attend to.
Holman pushed the file back towards the researchers. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the previously silent, boring containment strategist Kai Boskovich stood so forcefully he almost lost his glasses, snatching the file in the same movement.
This is a ridiculous risk for a possible breach of security.
Kai's slick brown hair waved as he speared the door open, Josh and Sanan following close behind. Just out of view, Holman could hear one say, "We'll come back with numbers," before the door closed. Undercover Agent, Wilson's top volunteer. Wajima Mayumi was a multi-purpose, stands on their own agent. Currently not tied to any MTF or SCP containment team, she wasn't more than a month or two out from having lost her three best friends in a containment breach, not even on assignment. She was psychologically evaluated, determined to be sane enough to keep working, but of course, she wasn't looking for anything intensive at the time. Something quieter, nicer, and in between something that was sure not to cost any more lives. And so, undercover as Hagamatsu Yafuyu, she was a Foundation plant at Wilson's Wildlife Shelter. Her home at Site 64 wasn't much more than an hour-and-a-half drive from where she wanted to be, and a 3-hour round trip was a small price to pay for basically being a volunteer animal handler. To keep up the facade of having a life outside of being a volunteer of the shelter, she only went to be a volunteer on Thursdays and weekends. The rest of that time was spent doing menial tasks and paperwork around Site 64, sometimes interrupted by a small, low-risk mission. She was dry cleaning a very small, very cuddly
but unfortunately electric seal when Albert Westren walked up. He was a scraggly stereotype of a man with a graying beard, completely bald head, and hands more than familiar with hard labor. He was Wajima's closest companion at the shelter, a fellow volunteer whose off days coincided well with hers. He was a berry farmer with a family, and they had schedules for tending the farm. Everyone took the weekends off, though, for the most part. Everything non essential was cut from the schedule. Almost every day he had free time, he would come down to the shelter, at least just to check in. If he truly didn't have time to hang around, he'd usually bring drinks and donuts. Needless to say, Wajima was happy to see him.
What's cracking, Al?
But Al was soon enamored in their pet project they had been working on together. The seal bounced and arfed, and tried to struggle out of Wajima's firm grip towards Albert. "Oh, someone's happy to see me," Albert bellowed in his ever loud, growly deep voice. He slipped on rubber gloves so he could safely pet Little Copper, named after copper wire, not its color. Wajima, seeing the moment was going to happen whether she liked it or not, released Copper to have a little handling session with Al. For as strong and stoic a man as he looked, it was not difficult to catch him in the act of becoming a big softy. It made him all the more charming, the way his looks and actions played off each other in the most subversive ways.
That makes two of us, Al.
Washima smiled at him. "Good to see you too, Haggy. How's Copper been?"
Copper's been fine. I was just scrubbing some of the muck off him when you came by and had to ruin it by being adorable.
"Sorry to interrupt." Al continued to scratch Copper's hand. "All right, little guy, go back to getting cleaned." Wajima carefully scooped up Copper and brought him back to her rubber-covered lap, and took a warm towel to several smidges on its otherwise shiny gray body. Copper squirmed, but Wajima was rough and stern, and had little to no issue keeping the slippery seal where she wanted it. Albert looked on with admiration.
All right.
Copper was gleaming as per usual.
He's ready to go back in his tank.
Wajima lifted him up and dumped him, he was making it hard to do otherwise, back into his little, lonely fish tank. The water was made strangely rigid, and Copper proceeded to swim around the inadequate tank. There were only some rocks and a little place where he could come out of the water onto a little rock beach, but otherwise, they couldn't put other fish in the tank with him because they died immediately. They couldn't return him to nature because he would go about killing everything in his wake. And how he ended up in an Oregon Creek to begin with, nobody really knows. And, well, that was it. But it was plenty problematic in and of itself. Today marked a week of Copper being in the care of the shelter, and he was perfectly healthy. They just had no idea what to do with him. Albert and Wajima exchanged looks and pursed lips.
So, all right. What are we going to do with him?
Albert scratched his beard. "Well, I talked to Tim, and we still don't know. He's not fit for the wild, or the wild isn't fit for him. And we don't put our animals above other animals."
Mostly.
Wajima snuck in a smile. "Well, sure. We name them, of course." They chuckled. But it was short and heavy. They didn't even have a very big enclosure for him. He was confined to an overblown fish tank in the middle of a green and wood room filled with chirping birds. Him being there had hindered their ability to take any other aquatic animals into their care, too. It was becoming quite a hassle, and the idea looming on the horizon, nobody wanted to put Copper down, and the longer he was around, and the more problems he caused, the more it felt like a necessity. But, as was said, nobody wanted that, which is why it hadn't happened yet, and why they still treated him like a guest and scrubbed him every once in a while. Wajima had it on her mind to push to release Copper, and then possibly adopt him as a skip back at Site 64. However, pushing that agenda would come off as out of character, and she would be met with resistance at every turn. It would almost certainly draw attention to her, and it would also interfere with her just an observer mission. Still,
What if we just keep him?
pardon? Al nodded his head as if agreeing with himself.
What if we just keep him? A little mascot. Copper. Of Wilson's Wildlife Shelter.
Wajima blinked a couple times. I mean, then we would have a permanent issue with the tank?
Nonsense.
Albert dismissed her.
We wouldn't possibly think of making Copper his own tank if he was just a guest like the rest of the animals. But with him as a pet, or a mascot, well, we could give him as big a tank as we like.
He's going to need a really big one if he grows like a normal seal.
We'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Are you certain?
Why not?
Albert reached a rubber glove into the water and stroked Copper as he swam past.
And we could use it as a push to direct the budget into making aquatic sector.
An aquatic sector?
We already have different cages for the birds so they don't interact negatively with each other. Eventually, we are going to need more than just one tank. And Copper is evidence. Wouldn't making the decision to keep him push Tim and the folks to make a better fishery?
Wajima was wide-eyed. I suppose. Are you sure we should set the precedent to keep animals? Is it in the budget? I guess the community does really like us.
Our fundraisers regularly cover whatever we don't make normally, and then some.
In the back of Wajima's head was a voice telling her it might not be a good idea to help the shelter keep animals that they would rather track as anomalies in the wild. Well, Copper stuck his head out of the water and made eye contact. Screw it. Let's do it. Tell Tim we're keeping Copper. We'll talk about it either tonight or tomorrow. Albert smiled a wide-toothy grin, though it was obscured by his monster mustache. And that's all the time we have for today, dear researchers. We'll be back next week with the next part, where we learn more about Wilson's Wildlife Solutions, which, honestly, if a group of interest in the SCP Wiki can be pleasant, this would be one of the ones that I'd say are just genuinely pleasant. But we'll be back next week. Good luck out there, everyone. It has been an honor reading for you, all of that, and make sure to get yourself some good sleep. I know at least one of you need it. But until next time, good luck out there. Goodbye.